Welcome to the Professionals of the Inland Empire show with your host, John Tulac.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Professionals of the Inland Empire, affectionately known as PI. I'm John Tulac, international business attorney in Claremont, and your host of this ongoing series featuring professionals of the Inland Empire, just like the title says. These are people who live and work in your community and who are experts in their field, can provide a lot of assistance to your business to help it grow and thrive. And today, my guest is Marco Costales, a good friend and colleague in the legal profession. Marco is with Nossaman. He's a business and corporate attorney, but he's got an extra focus. In addition to the stuff that you would normally associate with business and corporate law, he has a specialization area of dealing with the alcoholic and beverage control people. And I'm sure you've heard of who they are. So welcome, Marco, to the show.
Thank you, John. Thanks for having me. Pleasure.
I always start with, how did you get to where you are? And that includes, of course, how you ended up focusing on ABC matters. So tell us about the background story.
Sure. It's a strange thing because I was the first lawyer in the family, although my father was in hospitality his whole career. He came to the United States from Mexico right after World War II, didn't speak any English, had a young bride in tow, and was chopping blocks of ice at the Ambassador Hotel. Those of you that know the history of Los Angeles know that property. But he, ended up being a restaurateur. Later in his career, he worked at various hotels, including the Biltmore in downtown Los Angeles. So I kind of had it in my genes, but I really fell into this by virtue of my mentor at my first law firm. He represented clients both in the healthcare industry, but also in the hospitality industry. And that's how I fell into this niche area of practice that I have with beverage alcohol law. So when I was a young lawyer, I did a lot of the licensing work for major restaurant groups and a few hotels and things like that. And that just sort of carried over when I switched law firms back at the end of 1999. And I joined Nossaman, and I was fortunate that some of those clients followed me and just continued to practice in this area. I really enjoy it because there's a transactional component to it, but also an administrative law component. And it's exciting, right? You get to see the tangible results of your work. Restaurant opens up, a hotel opens up and has a full bar, those kinds of things.
I think that's always rewarding because, when you can actually see that what you did is reflected in what your client is doing, it's not just paper.
Exactly.
It is something that you can point to. So it is an interesting area of law, and it is much more pervasive than I think people understand. Obviously, they would see it with respect to a bar or a restaurant, but there's also a lot of other consumer protection involved. And let's talk a little bit about that. One of the things that you mentioned was the drink spiking prevention program. So tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, that has become quite an issue, and for bars in particular. So the California legislature enacted some new laws where if you go into your favorite watering hole and you ask, do you have a drink spiking kit? In other words, a kit that will test your drink to see if anything has been added to it. They must have it by law. And then recently, again, to sort of give more comfort to patrons, to consumers, there's another law in the books where if you ask, they have to have a cover for your drink. I've been in bars where sometimes people will put a coaster over their drink, but the covers have become very sophisticated. They're almost like, saran wrap or elastic type of things that people can put over their drink. And I've also seen people, ask the bartender, hey, will you watch this? Will you put a cover on it, or will you put it behind the bar while I go use the restroom, or I go, do whatever. And then so that I come back, I can be safe. So there's a lot going on in that area. And it is a consumer protection issue for sure.
Well, this is certainly a long way from the candy is dandy, but liquor is quicker. Once upon a time,
Correct.
the inability of people to behave responsibly toward one another is what invites increasing regulation, at least in the
Yeah.
state of California. Uh, was this something that, or maybe I should put it in the present tense, is this something that's quantifiable in terms of having a positive impact? Does this provide a good deterrence? Is it documented how many times somebody says, yeah, I think I
I
benefit
think,
from
yeah,
having that?
I think that the retail establishments, particularly bars, need to keep records if somebody, reports something in terms of keeping track of how many people asked for a drink to be tested or for a cover or things like that. I mean, I would always recommend that the establishment try and keep records of that. But we've all been in those situations where the place is just jam-packed, and that's really where the risk is highest.
Sure.
Where there are a lot of people at the bar. So I don't know if they're keeping the metrics that would be useful to evaluate that. But I think the thinking behind the legislative intent was if we can prevent just one or two of these things from happening, it's better to have to kind of put the onus on the establishment to have these things available. Um, so
Right. And of course, this is a kind of risk of a sexual assault or other harm that we want to spread that risk out. We want to mitigate, eliminate it, and so that cost gets spread out through society in a way,
correct.
which is something that we do in a lot of areas. So let's go to the other end of the spectrum, because one of the things that contributes to the cost of liquor in the state of California is the rules about who can distribute, under what circumstances you can distribute, what you can and can't do, and who you can and can't do it with.
Right.
So maybe tell us a little bit about that and just how hard it is to get paid sometimes if you're in the distribution space.
Yeah, well, taking just a step back for the audience in California and in a lot of states, but in California in particular, the alcohol industry is sort of bifurcated or trifurcated into three tiers. We call it the manufacturing tier. So those are your breweries, your wineries, your distilleries, the folks that make the stuff. Then you have the people that deliver the stuff and move it, right? Those are your wholesalers or your distributors. And then you have your retailers, right? This is where, I can go into a grocery store or buy a six-pack to consume off-site, or I can go to a bar or restaurant and have a cocktail with my meal or, at the bar. In California, those three tiers are intentionally kept separate. So there are some exceptions, but the general rule of thumb is thou shalt not have an interest in more than one tier. So it's very strictly construed, and particularly between wholesalers and retailers. So those two things have to be very separate, and you know, the flow of funds has become an issue recently, but this is really technology sort of, or the regulators playing catch up to technology. So, in the old days, a wholesaler would deliver product to a retailer, and a check would be cut, or if they had a credit, they would put it on credit, and at the end of the month, the retailer would have to settle up with the wholesaler. The legislature has recently put forth a bill in the assembly. I think it becomes law in January 2026. But now all transactions between the wholesalers on the one hand and the retailers on the other have to be done by electronic bank transfer, EBT. And this is a good thing, I think, because they're anytime you're dealing with checks or cash or whatever it is, shenanigans can happen. This is a way to sort of streamline that. And I think that's a positive for the industry. We're all waiting for the regulators to, get more with the technological times because when you do a liquor license transfer, for example, it is still very much paper driven. There's no e-filing available.
Mm.
If you need to pay your transfer fees, those are still done by paper check. There are a few things that you can pay online, but they're few and far between. So all of us in the industry are, waiting with bated breath to see when the Department of Alcoholic Beverage Control will start taking wire transfers, will start, modernizing their application process so that you can do all of this stuff online. Amazingly, even the feds are ahead of the state in this regard because the Alcohol, Tobacco Tax and Trade Bureau, what we call the TTB, they do have an online system to file for basic permits, but California so far does not.
Which is interesting because some of the departments have embraced electronic filing and indeed made it mandatory that they don't want paper anymore. Although some of the technology for the electronic stuff is still lacking. Like in the energy space, if you're filing a jet fuel or diesel return, monthly return, you do it electronically, but you have to do it with a flat file. And,
Mm.
and like nobody uses texts and flat files anymore.
Yeah,
And,
yeah,
and, and I taught electronic payment systems in letters of credit law school. I mean, letters of credit was something that I specialized in because it was a way for international payments to
yeah.
be assured for parties. And so trying to keep up with the technology, is actually something that helps keep costs down
Well,
for
it'll keep costs down and it'll make transfers, it should make transfers a bit easier. I'll give you an example. When you have a liquor license transfer, and I'll use a full bar license as an example because it's a little bit easier. You have to open an escrow. Money for the license has to go into that escrow. Money for the usable liquor inventory has to go into that escrow. And claims can be made against that escrow. It's kind of like a bulk sales for those lawyers out there. They'll understand what I'm talking about. And, I've had deals get hung up because a supplier will come in, a wholesaler or distributor will come in and say, we haven't been paid in 6 months. And so, you cannot transfer this license unless we are assured that the money sitting in that escrow, comes to us. And of course, similarly to the bankruptcy code, there is a statutory sort of waterfall system as to who gets paid first. Of course, it's the federal and state government. If there are any tax liens that have been imposed, those get paid. Then secured creditors, and then all the way down to your unsecured creditors. So I've had deals teeter because there've been amounts owed to suppliers, and you got to get those things cleared up in order for the license to transfer. So I think the EBT system will help eliminate some of that, or at least reduce some of it. You can always have a deadbeat retailer, and their liquor license is a valuable asset, and if the suppliers are patient enough, they'll cut them off for sure in terms of delivering product. But if they're owed a decent amount, they will, if they're smart, they'll bide their time. And if the business is, closing up and the license is going to be transferred, they should be able to get, some sort of payment out of that.
Interesting. So I want to circle back to kind of the top of this particular discussion area, and that is to observe that one of the things that's really special about California with respect to liquor is that we have all these choices. We have wineries and distilleries and craft breweries, all of which are centered here. And so all that product's available to us. We can join any wine club that we want, and wines can be brought into California and literally deposited on our doorstep. We can buy booze on Sunday. And we can get it at our grocery store as opposed to a state authorized liquor store that isn't going to be open on Sunday and is going to close at 9 o'clock
Early.
during the week. I mean, we
Yeah,
really do have it pretty darn good compared to a lot of other states, don't we?
we do. And I think I understand the theory behind those states that control the distribution or the sale of alcohol to consumers. There are certain states, Virginia is one, where you can't buy booze except at a state-run outlet. And like you said, John, they're not going to be open on a Sunday. They may have very limited hours of operation. So we are lucky in California. But in my view, alcohol is somewhat different than your typical consumer product, right? I mean, it has potential for abuse, and you don't want minors involved in it. And so, with all the choice and with all the amenities that we have with respect to this product, it is important that it still remain as regulated as it is, because it can be abused. And so balancing consumer desires and wants with public safety is huge, and that's a big part of the mission statement of the Department of Alcoholic Beverage Control, which we all call the ABC.
Sure. Of course, sometimes we have to deal with unintended consequences of what we think is a good policy. And I think to Hawaii back in the 70s, they were concerned about drinking and driving, so they outlawed the sale of single cans of beer and so on in the convenience stores. Well,
Right.
no problem, bro. They brought 6-packs and the
Right.
amount of drinking and driving went up.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. No, sometimes, the most well-intentioned legislation has, some disastrous effects. And there are still, the ABC has the ability to put conditions on licenses. So I'll give you an example. You might have what is known in the industry as an off-sale retailer. This is like a grocery store or convenience store. You're not going to drink the product on site. You're going to go purchase it to take with you. And those situations, depending on where it is, if it's in a high crime district, the ABC oftentimes will impose either size limitations or hours restrictions to try and combat some of those things. And so, whenever I'm involved in a deal, I always advise the clients, look, you should expect some conditions to be imposed on this license. It's very rare these days, even, in places like Beverly Hills or, what I would say upscale neighborhoods, you're looking at conditions of some type. And there are some standard ones, right? For example, for a restaurant license, they don't want, the gross sales of alcohol to exceed the gross sales of food, in any given month, right? So some of those make terrific sense. But, then they also allow, in those types of situations, the public to protest. So if a new license is going into a location that hadn't been licensed before, the public gets an ability to protest the issuance or transfer of that license, and that can have some real ramifications. I've got a couple things. Well, I had a restaurant in Long Beach several years ago that unfortunately the new owners took over and really turned the place around. It basically was a biker bar. It was, had lots of disciplinary issues associated with the old license, and they lost the license and the place sat empty for a while and these new owners came in. But boy, the ABC, just based on the history alone, put some really difficult conditions on it. And they had to live with them for a year, and then they hired us to try and modify some of those. And doggone it, if one neighbor out of, I would say a dozen complained, and we did not prevail at the administrative law hearing. So they were, they're still stuck with these hours restrictions that really have cut into their profits because they can't stay open later to, serve guests. So, and it can be abused. I mean, when I say the public can object, it basically means just about anybody. And I've got a hotel situation right now that is a non-union hotel, and the union is just throwing up obstacle after obstacle to try and in my opinion, just to sort of get back at them for not being a union premises. And so they're throwing up all sorts of, problems. So, but when you boil it down, the conditions are well intentioned. I mean, all of this is intended to keep, allow neighbors to have quiet enjoyment of their property, to keep, people from loitering, to keep underage drinking, from happening, all of that good stuff.
Yeah, and again, if you were to ask people, is this something that they want, you would likely see a substantial majority support it,
Correct.
even if they don't understand the process or how this is actually carried out.
Yeah.
So I wanted to cover one more thing with the time we have remaining, and that was
Sure.
something I was not aware of. It was something that is responsible beverage services training.
Yeah.
It's how to be a socially responsible barkeep. What
Yes.
Very interesting.
It is interesting. It pertains to retail licenses and on sale retail licenses. So, but it affects a wide swath of the industry because it says anybody that has an on sale retail license, all of their people that sell or serve alcohol and their managers, okay, have to go through what's called responsible beverage service training. And while the ABC had training programs in the past, they were primarily voluntary. They didn't cost anything, but to combat serving minors and to combat serving overly intoxicated patrons, they've now mandated this. And ABC, it's almost like a traffic school concept. So ABC has a list of preferred providers. These are third-party providers that almost, do it like a traffic school. It's an online program that you sit through and you have to pass. And then once you get past the third-party providers program, then you have to log on to the ABC's website and take their exam. And then you have to pass that, and then you get a digital certification. And again, very well-intentioned law, but it is very, I was a part of a stakeholder group when they were discussing this, and in my opinion, the ABC woefully underestimated how many establishments would need to do this. Because, I mean, you think of golf courses, right? The clubhouse. You think of airport lounges. You think of campgrounds that have a general store or, a facility where you can have a drink. It runs a gamut. And so, and the cycle is a 3-year cycle. So interestingly, we are now coming up on a renewal cycle. And we have been advising clients, I know it's not top of your mind, but you need to make sure all your people get their recertification and their managers, because that's a critical component here. The managers may just never touch a bottle or a glass, but they are required to have that certification, and you can be penalized and your license can be suspended if your folks don't have that certification. So it's it's not in its infancy because it's been around now for 3 years or so, but it's something that we tell people right off the bat. I've got a hotel deal right now where the general manager has been hired. First thing I was talking to owners of the hotel, you need to make sure your GM is RBS certified. So it is it's another cost of doing business too. I think some employers will pay for their folks to go through it. It's not a very expensive proposition, but it is something that could have dire consequences and could be costly in terms of fines and other things.
Yeah, and obviously the fines and penalties for messing around with ABC can be substantial. I mean,
Yeah.
that's just one of the dumbest things you could possibly do. One of
Absolutely.
the other dumbest possible things that you could possibly do is try to do this all yourself, because it is really complicated. And that's why we have people like Marco Costales to be able to help you so that you don't screw it up and lose your license or have to close for a period of time and so on. That's what this podcast is all about, featuring professionals in the Inland Empire who know what they're doing, and what they do really, really well. So if you're in that position and you need the help, you know where to reach out. That's it for today. Thank you, Marco, for being my guest. This is a quite fascinating topic that we could talk about a lot longer, but so long for now, everybody. We'll see you.
Thanks, John. Take care.
Thanks for watching or listening to, depending on the case, the Professionals of the Inland Empire show with your host, John W. Tulac. If you have a suggestion for a guest, email him at jwtulac, that's JWTULAC, @gmail.com. jwtulac @gmail.com.